This podcast is going to walk you through the judicial process in action. It is going to focus on the federal judiciary as opposed to the state level courts. It is important that you first complete the vocabulary class activities on symbols of justice, civil or criminal, grand jury, and jury so that you can fully understand the vocabulary used in this presentation. In order for any case to become part of the judicial system, a crime or a disagreement has to take place. This could be between people, or between the government and people, or the government and an entity or business or group. This determines if it's a civil case or a criminal case. In order for a case to end up in the federal courts, jurisdiction needs to be determined. Jurisdiction means that a court has the right or the power to interpret and apply the law. If you have a difficult time remembering jurisdiction, the first thing you can do is think about the police cars. If you see a police car in Bloomington, you know that it's going to patrol Bloomington. It has jurisdiction only in Bloomington, unless there's a special circumstance. For a case to end up in the federal court system, the guidelines, just like the city lines for a police car in Bloomington, the lines of limitations are outlined in the U.S. Constitution for the federal courts. Jurisdiction for the federal courts specifically is listed in Article 3, which is also where you'll find the judicial branch. There are 9 different areas that the courts have jurisdiction. Okay. If they're cases that are arising under the Constitution, so if they're related to topics directly outlined in the Constitution, that's probably the most popular or important thing that the courts could look at in the federal court system. If it's about a law or a treaty in the United States, if the cases are about ambassadors, they would also end up in the federal courts. If they're about maritime jurisdiction, so being out in the ocean in the Army or the Navy, this one's the second most substantial. If a controversy is naming the United States as a party, that means that someone is either suing the United States or the United States is suing someone else or putting them on trial. If there's a controversy between 2 or more states, that would also end up in the federal courts. An example of this would be Minnesota being upset with Illinois over its lack of control in its waterways to protect the Great Lakes from the Asian carp, or Colorado and Kansas arguing over water rights, which they do semi-regularly. If the case is between a state and citizens of another state, that would be another reason that it would be part of the federal jurisdiction, or if it's between citizens of different states. And finally, it's not quite finally, between citizens of the state claiming lands under grants of different states, so if there are land disputes, or finally between a state and the citizens of it and against foreign governments. So if the United States citizen wants to sue, say, Germany, it could end up in the federal courts. The federal courts are organized into 13 circuits. You see the large numbers over the continental United States. Then there's also the Federal Circuit and the DC Circuit, which are unnumbered, but those would constitute numbers 12 and 13. Guam is part of Circuit 9, as is Hawaii and Alaska. The federal courts are structured with 3 levels. The first level is the U.S. District Courts. They have 94 courts and 650 judges who work in that level. In the federal courts, they hear just over 200,000 cases a year. The second level of courts is the U.S. Court of Appeals. There are only 13 of those. You might recall this map. There are 13 districts. There are 13 appeals courts. There's 1 court of appeals for the federal districts in each of the circuits. There are 170 judges in the appeals court system, and they work in 3-judge teams. You'll notice that cases go from over 200,000 at the trial court level, or the district court level, to just over 30,000 cases in the appeals court system. So the number of cases drops substantially. Finally, at the top of the courts in the federal system, you have the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court. Most of its cases come from either the trial or appeals courts from the federal level, or some do come in from the state courts. They hear about 100 cases a year. We're going to walk through the process of the federal system. If you are going to have a trial at the federal system, before any federal criminal trial happens, a grand jury must be convened. In the picture, this is a grand jury room where the presentation would be made to the people to determine again if a trial is even necessary. Grand juries always meet in secret. This is where the grand jurors would sit, in that same room that you saw in the past slide. If a grand jury issues an indictment for a criminal case, or if it's a civil case, there's no grand jury necessary, then the case goes to the trial or district court. If you think of every TV show you see with a trial in it, they are showing the district or the trial level. All cases have one judge, they have witnesses and attorneys, a bailiff, and a court reporter. Most trial courts have juries also, though a defendant can waive their right to a jury trial. If that is the case, then only the judge would hear it. That is called a bench trial. At the trial court level, the argument is about guilt or innocence if it's a criminal case, and blame or responsibility if it's a civil case. From the trial court level, if you win the case and you're a defendant in a criminal case, the case is done. The government cannot appeal again. If it's a civil case, I don't know why you would appeal, but you could appeal. Maybe you didn't think you got enough money or something was amiss, but you could appeal if you wanted to from a civil case, either side. If you lose the case, if you are the government in a criminal case and you lose, you cannot appeal again. If it's a criminal case, the defendant who loses can appeal if there are constitutional problems with the case, not just because he or she doesn't like that he or she lost. They have to actually identify something constitutional that went wrong from the time that they were arrested to the time that their trial is completed. And finally, again, if it's a civil case, either side can appeal if they lose. Appeals go to the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals. Again, there are 33,000 cases a year heard in those 13 appeals courts. The picture that you're seeing is the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The judges work in the 3-judge panels. Unlike the trial court level, the appeals court no longer cares about guilt or innocence or blame. The 3-judge panels look at the constitutional issues or possible infractions which occurred between the start of the case and the end of the trial. It does not matter which side you are on at the appeals court level. If you lose, you can try to appeal to the Supreme Court. Pictured here is the United States Supreme Court. There is only one United States Supreme Court, and it's located in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court is asked to take just over 1,000 cases a year, but it only takes about 100, so give or take 10% of the cases. There is no higher court in this country. In the Supreme Court, you will find 9 justices. The 9 justices have equal votes. Sitting in the center front row of this picture is John Roberts, our 17th Chief Justice. You will also notice the 3 women in the picture. There have only been 4 women to ever serve in the Supreme Court, and the 3 are serving right now. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman to ever serve. She was appointed by Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and she stepped down a few years ago. Currently serving, you will see, in the front row on the right-hand side is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She has been dealing with quite a few health issues lately, and many suspect that she will retire soon. In the back left, you have Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by President Obama. And in the back row on the right, you have Elena Kagan, who was also appointed by President Obama. You are expected to know the Chief Justice, at least one of the women on the court, and at least one other justice. There's a link on our wiki that will give you the details for each of the justices. Right now the court is 5 conservative and 4 liberal justices, but Justice Anthony Kennedy, who is in the front row sitting to the left of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Anthony Kennedy is a conservative, but he's very moderate. In fact, he's called a swing vote. Because he's a swing vote, that means that oftentimes the liberals, with a good argument, can get him to vote with them. So if there's a 5-4 decision in the court, oftentimes that's because Anthony Kennedy made the 5 of the majority. If you're going to hear your case or argue your case in front of the United States Supreme Court, you get 30 minutes on a typical argument. We talked about that with the healthcare debate and how it was unusual for them to have so many hours dedicated to one case. A typical case, oral arguments are 30 minutes long, and they are heard from the first Monday in October through about early May, and then all of the decisions are handed out for that term before the end of June. The United States Supreme Court has 4 options of what it can do with a case. Its first option is to affirm the lower court's decision. That means that it agrees with the appeals court decision that came to it. The second option that it can do is modify the appeals court decision without completely reversing it. So they could say, well, you're mostly right, but we disagree with this one little part. The third option would be to reverse the case. That means if A won in the appeals court, B would win in the Supreme Court. And they could say, that's it, we're done, nothing else needs to happen. The fourth option would be to reverse and remand. That means that not only do they change the outcome of the appeals court, but they send it back, saying, do it again. The Supreme Court issues its opinions or its decisions in opinions. There are 3 different types of opinions. The first is a majority opinion. You need a majority of justices to win the case in Supreme Court. Most of the time, that's 5. The majority opinion lists why the justices are agreeing as they are, or deciding as they are. There's a dissenting opinion. That is also known sometimes as the minority opinion. This is where the justices who disagree with the majority list the reasons that they disagree and why they think the outcome of the case should have been different. The third opinion that could be issued is called a concurring opinion. If a concurring opinion is issued, that would mean that a justice agrees with the outcome of an opinion, either majority or dissenting, but not the reasoning. So let's say that there's a majority opinion that says B wins, and Justice number 3 writes a concurring opinion. That justice does agree that B wins, however, not for the same reasons, and the justice would want to explain those opinions.